As you note from this introduction, my name is Dr. Gabriel Eke. I'm going to be
I hear you very well.
speaking to you on Pan-Africanism, Africanism, and the Orange Union Principle. Before I start, a little bit of apology because I'm going to be reading most of this time. Normally, I make my speeches quite free with no notes at all. But I believe this topic is extremely important. So, and I know it's been recorded as well. So I would like it read out as it's printed, so the information sits there for as long as possible for everybody to see. Now, of course, in terms of questions and answers, I'll be glad to take questions as well if the opportunity comes. So, you're going to hear me talk about the word ethnic, ethnicity. You'll be hearing that a lot. And for a very good reason. Let me just state the first thing, which is the Berlin Conference, which we're talking about now. It actually introduced and entrenched what I call a busybody politics into Africa. It's the politics whereby you get involved in things you shouldn't be getting involved in. So you can see where the confusion starts. And this sort of busybody politics has been wedged between the ethnic nations that existed for thousands of years. When you look at the Berlin Conference problem, what I want us to do is, I want us to look at it as detectives. It's a crime scene. So if you want to understand it, you must be a detective. That's the mindset. So the wrong type of politics was wedged between the ethnic nations that already existed. And that's where the problem starts. And you're going to have to pay attention to that. You really have to, okay? Now, this basically poisoned and paralyzed the development of all those nations that existed. It wasn't a joke when you look at the conference. It lasted for 104 days. I've attended all sorts of conferences. The longest conference I attended lasted 6 days. The Berlin conference lasted 104 days. That's a very awful long time. So it's a conference that is shouting at you, saying, look at me. I've got the world record for conferences. Look at me, pay attention to me. But unfortunately, for far too long, the Berlin Conference is being ignored, and it has been ignored for most of the time. Now, obviously, it was a Western European agenda to abolish the indigenous self-governance in Africa. We've heard a lot about the repercussions. We're going to hear more about them. Anybody who genuinely wants to see a world thriving in development and progress understands that only those who are at peace with themselves can offer peace around the world. So if you look at the history of Africa, there were a few very small number of empires. in pre-colonial Africa? Perhaps a couple. But ever since the Arab intrusion and the Western European intrusion, you started getting a few empires. Before that, what you really had were sovereign kingdoms, about 30,000 of them. So basically, pre-colonial Africa was the champion in sovereignty. It is very important to understand what pre-colonial Africa was, because we're going to talk about the Sankofa effect, whereby you progress with hindsight. And if you don't know what pre-colonial Africa was all about, it will be very difficult for you to understand why you must base your future progress on the great legacy of pre-colonial Africa. So, obviously, you've heard about Pan-Africanism. Now, it's been around for about 2 centuries now. And most people know about the 1945 Manchester Conference. But Pan-Africanism goes way back for at least about 2 centuries. And what is Pan-Africanism, by the way? So, I mean, it's largely a philosophical and ideological response to racism that's been around for almost 2 centuries. Now, its purpose was to tackle the suffocation of Africans from colonialism and racism. And these were the 2 edges of the same genocidal sword. You hear the word genocide and you wonder. First, I talk about crimes and things. You hear genocide and you wonder why. Well, just to give it a bit of context, when you look at what the different types of slavery were, whether you're talking trans-Saharan, transatlantic, what it basically meant was the victim dies instantly or dies within a few months or dies within 5 years. So it's either instant death if you're enslaved or a slow death. So 60% of the enslaved will inadvertently die a slow death. That's why it's actually a genocide and not just a trade. The word trade is an insult. It's actually a genocide. It's not a trade. So when you hear colonialism and racism being mentioned as the 2 edges of the same genocidal sword, you get a bit of context. Now, Pan-Africanism was a clarion call to rally the people of African descent across the globe for a concerted effort to relieve Africans of the subhuman subjugation, although it was focusing on the skin color as the rallying point and the basis for strategic victory. The geopolitics of the world at that time was all about skin color, unfortunately. Rather unfortunately. But so Pan-Africanism obviously was trying to give the Africans a bit of relief. So the rallying of all sorts of people from everywhere who had a dark skin color was the basis for Pan-Africanism, to try and stop colonialism, stop racism, and things like that. Now, you have 2 forms of Pan-Africanism, okay? The one form that seeks absolute conformity by total abolition of the ancestral colonial borders under a unitary super government. So sometimes you hear the talk of Pan-Africanism, and it's looking for a collection of everybody under a single outer border and no internal borders. That's one option. And then you have the other option where you have internal borders, colonial borders, and all you do is just trade and do some sort of collaboration across your borders. You're going to wonder why Pan-Africanism has been talked about for a long time now. We need to ask ourselves a few questions about it. Now, in both forms of Pan-Africanism, I would have to say this, they actually deny the pioneering creativity of the African ancestors. Why do I say this? When Pan-Africanism misses the Sankofa effect, then it becomes ineffective. The people who talked about Pan-Africanism are great intellectual minds. These were very intelligent people. So you can't deny them that. They were facing a very serious existential situation. The positive for us now is we have more hindsight than they did. And what we must stop doing is ignoring the hindsight that we have now. They did not pay enough attention to the ancestral borders. Pay attention to that, because that's the problem. And we're going to see why. Why is the ancestral border important? There are so many natural principles in the African society. You hear words like Ubuntu, Igwebike, and things like that. And it's talking about the greatness of a community living, how the people live together. But what you need to understand is, even though you may not shut the door or, the enclosures of your barn, you will normally shut the door to your hut. So you don't go to bed at night to sleep and leave the door ajar. And likewise, the ancestral borders were there for a reason. So anything that ignores your ancestral border will be a problem. Whether you like it or not, it will be a problem. We need to pay attention to that. Now, neither of these forms of Pan-Africanism has materialized in practice. And we hear a lot of talk about them. But why have they not materialized? What is the problem? And the question is, can a direct cause of failure be traced to the... Could that be the reason? What is the significance of the ancestral borders? And why did the Berlin Conference insist on undermining those borders? If you spend 104 days arranging a conference or discussing plans and strategies, I don't think they were just having a lot of drink for 104 days. There's a lot of planning involved. You need to bear in mind that before the conference, there was a lot of explorers that had been around already. A lot of reconnaissance had taken place. At some point, you will understand that there was a lot of military activities going on from the Berlin Conference nations when it comes to Africa. Now, so this question of the borders, the ancestral borders, is really important. And I'm very certain that it will solve the puzzle about the development of Africa. What has borders got to do with development? There are two types of development. One is the socio-economic, the other is the infrastructural. Your border holds your culture and your identity, and it holds your consensus. You can begin to see the connection between your identity, your cultural commonalities, and your consensus as a community. And where you have consensus well stabilized, you're going to have a community agreement or constitution that will very equally match the compliance of the people. It will be very difficult to comply to a constitution that conflicts your personal, your culture. It will need a dictatorship. It will need brute force. So if a constitution goes against your religion or it goes against your culture, your compliance will be low. That is why your constitution must match your culture. And for some people, it will have to match a bit of your belief system. So where your constitution is conflicting with your culture, your compliance will be terribly low. If you look at those almost 30,000 sovereign kingdoms in pre-colonial Africa, the vast majority of them did not even have a prison. Criminality was zero. And that's for a good reason. Because the conformity and the culture was straightforward. So a community like that will develop rather quickly. There'll be peaceful coexistence. The minute you destroy that border, you're going to have some problems. And in pre-colonial Africa, there was a lot of what we call elder custodianship, whereby they had to make sure that the borders were being reviewed annually and that there was constant agreement with the neighboring kingdoms. And they did that very well for thousands of years. For a good reason. So we also have to pay attention to these things. You cannot develop if your constitution is conflicting with your culture. Your constitution is foundational. It is critical. And if it doesn't match your culture, you're going to be having a few problems. Your political structures will be dysfunctional if your constitution does not match your culture. And if your political structures are dysfunctional, your economy will be closer to tatters than success. So you can see the connection between your identity, your consensus as a community, your constitution, your functional political structures, your socio-economic development. It's a long jump, but you can see the connection now. So that's why it's very important not to ignore your ancestral border or your ethnic identity. There's nothing wrong with your ethnic identity. It's been there for thousands of years before you. You can't be more clever than your ancestors. If you think you're more clever than your ancestors, I dare you to start a new nation as an ancestor yourself. That word ancestor is a very important word, as long as you study it and understand it. So, I'm going to use Nigeria as an example, because the population of Nigeria is about a third of the entire African continent. So essentially, Nigeria is, let's say, a small Africa. It's a continent, more or less. And it has hundreds and hundreds of ethnic nations within its geographical expression. Why has Pan-Africanism not succeeded within that small Africa known as Nigeria? Because if we want Pan-Africanism to succeed across the entire African continent, we must take a small template, a small sample. And Nigeria is the best small sample you can get. It has a third of the entire continent. If it doesn't succeed, why do you think the entire continent will succeed? So this takes us back to what is the real problem. The reason why we're here discussing the Berlin Conference is because the Berlin Conference is the real problem. And we need to stop ignoring it, okay, if we want to solve the problem. Now, the Pan-Africanism that was started by the forefathers, they did well because they were dealing with trying to get rid of the racist, get rid of the colonialist. And I have to say they did a fair job on that. Of course, what they did not succeed in doing, as you notice, if you look at the Cairo Declaration of 1974, as Professor Hardy mentioned, you see that there was a decision to keep the colonial borders. Now we know by all research that that was a disastrous decision. Why is that? Because you get rid of the colonialists, as in physically said, oh, go, go, go. But the damage that has been done has not been looked at. So, the job. What we need to do is now start looking at the damage that was done. Why was that conference not 4 days? Why was it 104 days? Why did it not deal with each nation? Why did it have to cancel the borders, disfigure the whole place? Now, let's just go back a little bit. The first Western Europeans that came to the African shores, let's be honest, they didn't come shooting at people. And for about a whole generation, they were trading normally. So they could trade normally. They didn't. So they could have continued trading normally. There was no need to split this border, split that border. I don't know how many of you have seen the rattle python attack the hens and chickens. If you're not living in a village, you wouldn't know this. I've seen that myself. And what it does is it clucks like a hen. The rattle python clucks like a hen. And the chicks approach because they think that's a hen, the mother calling. And what the rattle python does is, because it's got signals to sense movement, it can't see properly, but it can pick up movements excellently. Positional movements. It will lash its tail and cause chaos. And in that chaos, most of the hens actually flee for their lives. And it picks up the chicks one by one. There are only a few, I don't know how to explain that, a few hens that will stand and fight. Most of them will flee. It's a deadly sight if you see it. So when you bring in the Berlin Conference, you create divisions of the borders, you split everything, and you put the wrong person with the wrong person, but that's all deliberate. Okay? Because the explorers know everybody. They've gone there, they've traveled, they've discovered all the river Nigers, they've discovered all the Victoria Falls. So it's not as if they don't know the borders, they know all of that. But the idea was to split in a configuration that will be dysfunctional, because that's the only way you can do exploitation. Because otherwise, if you trade with each nation that has its own consensus, you will have to bargain. You don't get a lot of traitors in a homogeneous community. It's very difficult. It is 25 times more difficult to get a traitor in a homogeneous community. But if you mix so many cooks to cook the broth, it will be a sour broth. So it is simple common sense, and we need to pay attention to it. Now, we see that small Nigeria, as a third of Africa, is not managing with Pan-Africanism. It's not succeeded. It's not bad governance. It's not bad leadership. And it's not corruption. These are the media cliches that continue to put our eyes away from the real problem. The real problem is the wrong configuration. That's the problem. Problem is not bad governance. And let's talk about governance for a bit. I'll use an analogy here, because if you've got a car, you have one. If your car is a bad one, it's a bad one. If your car is a good one, it's a good one. If you don't have a car, you don't have a bad car. You just don't have a car. Government. You don't have a bad governance. You just don't have a government. So there's a lot of common sense to it. What are the criteria to say you have a government? There are 5 basic mandatory criteria. Adequate water, adequate food, adequate security, basic health and safety, transparent judiciary. If you miss any one of those 5, you don't have a government. It's as simple as that. And you can take this to anywhere on the face of this earth and check my words on that. What is bad governance? Bad governance means you actually have a government. You've met all the 5 basic mandatory criteria. But at the end of the annual revision, you have failed in your budget promises. That is a bad government. A good government will meet up with the promises. So that's the difference. But if you can't provide adequate water, you don't have a government. It's not that you have a bad government. No, you don't have a government at all. So when a lot of people keep thinking they've got a government when they don't have it, they're driving the Mercedes-Benz in their dreams. But they're walking on foot. So it's not bad governance. They're just the government. There's no government. There's no governance. It's sad to say, but that's the truth. And the reason why you have a dysfunctional political structure is so that you can't have a government. So it all goes back to the foundations again. Get your identity right. Get your collective community right. You will get your consensus right. You will get your political structures right. Your economy will be a lot better. Your development will be rapid. And by the way, once you do have the right governance structure, socio-economic development is usually achieved within 5 to 25 years, not more than 25 years. What is socio-economic development? What is it? The vast majority of your population can consistently feed themselves, shelter themselves, and clothe themselves. That's it. Infrastructural development is where you get your infrastructures. That may take more time. Now, Africanism, that's the next topic. Essentially, the formal recognition of the independence of the indigenous African communities and nations. It is the pinnacle of African self-esteem and self-worth in a way that the entire world is seen and perceived through the lenses of African civilization and culture. This is not just an Afrocentric sentiment, but the assurance that Africa is the host, filtering the global chaff from the seed. This Africanism basically means the elevation of the indigenous African language, culture, and homeland above any non-indigenous order. So when Africanism is working, it means most likely your own language will be having some official status as well in your territory. If your language is buried beneath the soil in your own homeland, you don't have Africanism. Now, can Africanism be vulnerable? Yes, it can be. So even if you're a wonderful ethnic nation on your own, doing very well, you may be vulnerable in a world of sophisticated degradation and geopolitical antagonism, where moral and cultural bankruptcy is rife. You may be invaded. So you're better off having something more than just, you're better off having an alliance. Why do you need an alliance? Well, your survival will be a lot better if you have more of you working together. Now, let's just mention a little bit about the virtues of pre-colonial Africa, because there's a lot of misconceptions actually about pre-colonial Africa. Let's mention the fact that wars were extremely rare. Now, this will come as a surprise for many people who think in pre-colonial Africa there was wars every day. Not really, no. Wars were very rare. That's the truth. And when I say pre-colonial Africa, you need to understand that's before the Arab invasion, the West European invasion. There's a principle that I just, which is the principle of natural intelligence. And basically, it's a common sense and common science principle that stipulates that history cannot be properly narrated or told outside the context of culture. I mean, my own paternal grandmother told me this, something which her grandmother told her, that wars were extremely rare. And if the price of salt goes up, there's almost certainly going to be a war. And from the generation of my great-great-grandmother, there was no war. So her entire life, her daughters, her granddaughters, my fathers, obviously, by the time it got to my father's time, there was a war called the Biafra genocide. Now, so wars were not, look, you can't be having war when you're living an eco-friendly life. What are you fighting for? So if you hear people talking about pre-colonial Africa having a lot of wars, that's not true. Okay? Get that fact right, because otherwise you wouldn't know why you should have the Sankofa effect, why you should look back to your ancestral successes and take a leaf from them. We can also talk about the traditions of environmental custodianship that was popular in pre-colonial Africa. You do not cut every tree for fire, for instance. Why? Some woods, if you use them, will be dangerous to your health. You did not kill any birds. There were certain birds you don't touch, otherwise you'll have a locust invasion on your farms. So there was a lot of science behind how pre-colonial Africa existed. A lot of science behind it. You also did not go to farm on certain days, purely because you had to allow the animals to have a bit of free space from human activity. The exploitation that was devastating to the environment was introduced by non-Africans, mostly in the form of exporting humans and materials from Africa. It is important to know that child labor was an abomination in pre-colonial Africa, as is reflected in the names given to children. If you look at Africa now, you see child labor. In pre-colonial Africa, you will never see that. The African names that were given to children were usually a prophetic code that stemmed from the history of the community and the outlook for the future. The African community in pre-colonial Africa was a community of people. You will never be lonely. Now, if a child was born, for instance, the entire neighborhood celebrated on that, and it had to be done that day, the very day the child is born. The fact that women actually had the primary role of poverty prevention in pre-colonial Africa is often forgotten, and perhaps deliberately so. So it was mostly women that had the role to prevent poverty. you probably will think it was the men. Well, that's not the case. Again, that's something most people wouldn't know. But history will give you a clue. In 1929, you had the Aba Women's Riot and Revolt against colonial taxation. In 1945, you had the Abeokuta Women's Revolt and Riot against colonial taxation. That's just giving you a little hint. Why? The basis for socio-economics in pre-colonial Africa was called communalism. So the community works together and shares wealth. Virtually everybody in pre-colonial Africa was educated on the general rules as well as additional vocational education, depending on your occupation. You had people who were botanists, people who were biologists, people who were mycologists. Well, mycologists, you specialize in mushrooms, knowing how mushrooms are done, looked after, which one you eat, which one you don't eat. Only women studied that one. And not everybody studied it. It could be dangerous, the business mushrooms in those things.
Just to give you a 5-minute warning.
Well done. You had artisans who traveled and taught everybody else how to do certain skills. You had zoologists. You had people who were especially zoology anatomists. I witnessed one myself in 1980. And when I went to medical school, then I realized how incredible a skill that was. These are ancient cultures which we don't even know about. You had people who were specialists in metals and metallurgy, physiotherapists who would travel and lecture a whole group of people, and they'll spend a whole week doing lectures about this sort of things. Midwives, of course, there were only women. Herbalists, you can guess for yourself. Now, let's delve into what the solution is. It's called the originate principle. The harmony of nature offers more than natural intelligence. And we believe that the African ancestors observed nature as perhaps the best environmentalists that ever lived because they maintained the ancestral borders sacrosanct for thousands of years. The orange fruit, despite its outward appearance of a singular entity, shields multiple distinct segments, each uniquely capable, regardless of shape or size, to replicate the wholesomeness of the orange without interfering in the integrity of the other segments. It is this respect for the ancestral segments of Africa that underpins the originate principle. Not only, but it projects the Africanism of each segment, each ethnic segment is a wholesome community, and then it collaborates with the other communities. Now, the original principle ultimately recognizes the ancestral borders, but above all, it relies on a formula for mutually beneficial collaboration between all the ethnic nations while preventing the unnecessary interferences that come from the colonial arrangements. The most significant advantage of the original principle is that it restores the natural condition for maximizing local consensus to establish the relevant functional political structures which become the basis for guaranteed socio-economic and infrastructural development within predictable timelines. Usually within 25 years, you must be developed if you're within an original principle. It's as simple as that, not 140 years, 25 years. If you're very smart, 5 years. So if you see any country in Africa not achieving development after 4, this is why it doesn't have the original principle, and it needs it. The original model does not only recognize ethnic self-governance, but it encourages sub-ethnic autonomy within each ethnic nation that becomes a member state of the original arrangement. It is worth noting that whilst the original principle prevents political interference between the ethnic nations, it requires mutually beneficial affairs on which the member ethnic nations collaborate. This model proposes 6 mandatory affairs for collaboration and 1 optional affair The optional affair for collaboration is called sports development. So your nation may want to have its own sports national team, or it may want to combine with a few other nations. In the UK, for Olympics, you have the four coming together. For football, they go separate ways. The 6 mandatory affairs for collaboration are trade, you have a common currency with a reserve bank, transportation, that's important, security, border control, international relations, and an arbitration court. What's the difference between a self-determined ethnic nation and a sovereign ethnic nation? A sovereign ethnic nation has its own independent international relations. Your diplomatic mission is independent. If you're self-determined alone, you will work with others to have one mission. That's the difference. Otherwise, a self-determined ethnic nation is as good as sovereign, just that it cannot decide its own who must be ambassador here or there. It has to be agreed as a collective. So the best way you want to get the Pan-Africanism successful is the Orange Union model. Now, just to wrap that up, there's a few details about Orange Union, which I'll be happy to take even when the questions come up, because there are a bit more practical issues there. But suffice to say that the Sankofa effect, which means progress forwards with hindsight. If you forget your hindsight, if you lose your memory of your authentic histories, your destiny will be in shambles. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of I think you navigated quite a few things. I would have wanted a bit more empirical evidence to support some of the things that you were saying. And with regards to the solution that you're presenting, I was wondering if you had come across the works of Chancellor Williams, who did this deep dive in 26 countries and about their the structure and how they operated pre-colonial Africa, and if then that had any impact on the formulation of your solution.
Yeah, it does. It does. So, for instance, my father's town or kingdom is a union of 3 kingdoms. So basically, pre-colonial Africa already had this Orange Union idea. So we're not the smart ones inventing it. We're just looking back and learning from them. What we're doing is trying to bring it into the modern time and adapt certain things. But secondly, the idea of an ethnic nation collaborating with neighboring ethnic nations, it's been there centuries and centuries ago. It's actually been there already. But what we now want it across the entire Africa, not just in one little area. Because we believe it will impact the diaspora Africa as well, in a good way. Because I believe the diaspora Africa has been waiting for far too long on Africa. And Africa is just not delivering what it should deliver. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, just quickly. Because you have this name for it, I'm not even sure exactly what it says.
The reason for that name is because if you look at the orange, it has an external skin. If you peel it, it will have multiple segments inside. So we believe each segment inside is an ethnic nation. And then the peeling around it is actually a defensive structure that unites them.
Because I mentioned Chancellor Williams, he describes this thing as the ancient empire of Ethiopia with its 12 regions and its one kingdom, making a 13 that oversees all of this. So I was asking if, you've looked into that to come forward with this.
No, We looked at other models, but you can see for yourself that it's a similar thing. Now, let's be honest about the original thing. Even the UK at the moment has a bit of original idea as well. Once you have an ethnic nation having its devolution or self-governance and working with others, you are sort of an original.
Okay.
Actually, if it's okay, I'm going to use my facilitator's privilege here. I think that was something you said right at the start, and I take your point about the need for governance, constitutions being the need for them to be aligned with culture.
Yeah.
However, culture is not static; it's constantly evolving and changing. So, what's the most effective governance response to that? And if it's okay, there's a couple of questions online that absolutely relate to that. So, one of that is what's the difference between bad governance and no governance at all? Perhaps is what do you think the difference is between a nation and a country? Maybe I'll also throw and a state into that.
Yeah.
And another very important question is: do you have a book out?
It's on its way.
Please.
Okay, so the first one, bad governance and no governance. Well, so again, no governance means you cannot meet the criteria for governance anyway. So, for instance, you have transparent judiciary, you have healthcare, you have adequate security, you have adequate food, but you don't have adequate water. Well, you don't have a government, I'm sorry. You don't. You're not a serious person. Okay? Now, bad governance means you have all of them. You're not doing bad at all. But when you set your budget for the year, at the end of the year, you're short of it. You're failing in your promises. That's bad governance.
And to make a slide comment about the government here in Britain.
Yes, I mean, yeah,
You're not delivering the goods for some
if
time.
you can't deliver what you promised, then that's bad. Now, in terms of nation and country, well, nation basically talks about cultural commonality. Okay, it's usually a sort of ethnicity and nationality. It's more about your culture and your ancestral sort of origin and collective. But a country would be, sometimes the nation could be a country, but a country can even be bigger than a nation. It could have a few coming together as a country. And usually countries is talking about territory, right? And then obviously, if you look at state, you're looking at a structure of government. That's more what you reflect as a state.
Very mindful of time, which is very much against us, but I think we can get maybe one or two, maybe three questions in the room. I'll start with the gentleman in the middle with the yellow tie, because your hand up was up first, and then I'll go to the gentleman behind and then gentleman there. So please, after you.
So I wrote my question down. I apologize to take this back, but I just wanted to understand. So with Africa championing sovereignty, and I'd assume that they would have like a strong societal cohesion and unity within their communities. So then how was colonialism able to like succeed in these conditions?
Yeah, so it's actually not a difficult one. There are two reasons. I'm just going to go to the one. In pre-colonial Africa, over the years and millennia, they got used to dialogue. You settled with dialogue. You sat down, you discussed and agreed and whatever. Because wars were too expensive, too dangerous. If you were not careful, after a war, you have a disease. The war might kill 10% of your population, but the disease can wipe out 90% of your population. So wars were too expensive for them. They had to really be careful. Now, when the Arabs and later on the West Europeans came, you're looking at an African civilization that was used to dialogue, not too interested in killing and all that. Whereas if you look at the history where Western Europe has gone through, it's actually sophisticated that art of killing. So it's not a difficult thing to understand that you've got this powerful weapon, stronger than that one, and of course, that's it. You're done. So that's why that happened.
So just to go on, so this might be like a more psychological question. So if they knew that they could colonize Africa with the sword, then why would they spend 1 year trading with African countries?
No, so put it this way, there was initial trading, which was a genuine trading, okay? But you would occasionally get bad eggs, unfortunately. And what that means is, at some point, there were people who were not just traders, they were spies. And so they'd done surveillance and reconnaissance. And after 25 years, you could see the effect of that. So they didn't, you don't just go and start, you don't know what's in there. So you've got to be careful. You survey the place first. And that's what they did. So all the explorers, you explore, but you also pick in information.
Well, thank you. Great question. And I'll take the gentleman right behind you, and then I'll take the gentleman on the end after that. Maybe if we take the two questions and you can answer them.
Absolutely.
For reasons of time.
Yeah, mine is very simple. It means.
So Sankofa, as far as I know, is a Western African word. Now, it's like the words we use in different languages, but what it means is you are looking back to learn how to progress forwards. So you're going forwards, but you're also bearing in mind all the lessons from before. So it's basically, the way I summarize it is you are progressing with hindsight. You've learned a lot from your past. Because the truth is, history is actually destiny, if you look at it closely. And contrary to what you hear, history is the oldest science. It's not an art, it's a science. So you probably hear everybody telling you history is art. It's not, it's science. Retrospective analysis is history, and that is one of the key methods of science.
I can't see how and why, but it seems to me that's linked to the ancestry tradition that we have in Africa. I mean, we call it, worship the ancestor, but it's actually looking back, isn't it? It's actually, we just now for today we look back at that with, they were actually worshiping ancestors, but actually what they're doing is
you're just learning lessons from the past.
Studying history.
You're learning your lessons from the past, not to make the mistakes again.
I was thinking it's
There's another question, I think.
Yeah, I was just about to say, an excellent question for your answer. I'll take the last question from you, sir, and then we must move on. So please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. Dr. Eke, thank you for the brilliant delivery. I really enjoyed that. But you actually mentioned the Cairo Conference, 1974.
Yeah.
Where you stated that the likes of Nkrumah, the great President Nyerere, they were very, very key to that very conference. That the fact that they never got rid of the borders, that was a fundamental big mistake.
Yeah.
Did these leaders at that time have any choice? Would they have ever been able to get rid of those borders anyway? So when we say they made a fundamental mistake, did they really truly have the choice? Because there was no way, I think, to get rid of those borders.
Should I answer or take another question?
If you could just answer, because I'm very mindful.
So basically, they had the choice, and actually they could. The problem is twofold. You were getting a lot of people advising as well, unfortunately. And there was an advice at the time that if you went to change the borders, you might cause a war. And that's not true, because you are not changing the border. You are just acknowledging what was already there. So a lot of it, it's mostly in the mind anyway. And if you get it wrong in the mind, you step wrongly. So you are acknowledging a border that actually exists. You're not changing anything. So basically, someone came, broke your windscreen, and says, "Don't fix it, because if you did, and then you agreed. Well, you should fix it.
Just point of
Very
information.
soon, we're going to have to close the Q&A now, just to enable the next set of speakers.
Point of information.
If you could make it in under 10 seconds.
Resolution 1514 enshrined those borders in 1960, so that at the era of independence, right?
Right. That's one of the problems. Because you accept something which you should actually change, not accept.